Hey, what's up, y'all? My name is Dennis Heil, and I am diagnosed with type 2 bipolar disorder with severe depression and high-functioning autism. I've been living with bipolar disorder for over 30 years, 15 of which I spent undiagnosed. In 2009, I experienced a depressive psychotic break that led to my diagnosis of type 2 bipolar disorder. I would be diagnosed with autism a few years later. In my podcast, Bluntly Bipolar, I'm going to share with you my experiences and the hard lessons I've learned trying to find some peace and happiness in my life. I hope that by sharing my experiences, others can avoid learning these lessons the hard way. I'm not a mental health professional. All I am is a mental patient with a microphone. Listener discretion is advised. In this bonus episode, I would like to introduce you to a book that I think would have helped me, a straight white man, avoid years of being angry at the wrong people. That book is 50 Truths They Tried to Erase: Black Power, Culture, and Resistance Uncovered by Freddie E. Taylor. Now, I promise this is relevant to mental health, particularly for men like me, so bear with me. Before we do that, in the interest of full disclosure, I have not been compensated for this episode in any way, and I have been in contact with this company, Urban Intellectuals, twice. The first time was to provide feedback on some formatting errors I noticed that I felt should be corrected. The second time was to ask if they intended to fix them, which they assured me they would, and I asked permission to review the book. I know I didn't have to ask permission to do a review, but I chose to out of respect for Mr. Taylor and his work. There's a common perception of white folks trying to take the credit for the work of black folks, and I felt like asking permission while clarifying my intentions was a good way to acknowledge that. So that being said, I am a 46-year-old straight white man from a working class blue-collar background. I've lived in a predominantly conservative area in Ohio most of my life. As a teenager and young man, I spent years drowning in anger from undiagnosed bipolar disorder, depression, and high-functioning autism. As a result, I spent my time swimming in the sewers of the internet, the kind of places that help create the alt-right and elevate white Christian nationalism and Trump. Now, anger is a common manifestation of depression in men due to our social conditioning. And that's something I experienced myself for years, because ain't no one got time for your sorry ass. We got work to do. Suck it up, cupcake. But anger gets space. Anger gets respect, even though it's not healthy. In my case, I had to deal with the anger on both sides of the disorder. Now, in depression, I would often have a low-grade seething anger in the pit of my stomach. Now, in hypomania, it would emerge as rage, hostility, aggression, and paranoia. In the past 33 years that I've been living with bipolar disorder, I can count on one hand the number of days I've experienced euphoria. So I say that all to say I am not the target audience for this book. However, I want to tell you why I think Freddie E. Taylor's book, 50 Truths They Tried to Erase, may have helped me as a young, angry white man trying to figure out how I fit into society, and why I encourage all white people to pick up a copy. Mr. Taylor's book does two things well. The first is to provide a point of entry about some of the propaganda regarding Black history in America in an easily digestible format. It's an easy read. You can pick any chapter, get a general gist of the situation, and then use that as a springboard for further research. Each chapter is only 4 pages long, so it's very easy to digest. The second is that he often illustrates messaging that shapes cultural and social perception of Black folks. That's relevant for we white people because a lot of it affects us too. It's targeted at us. They need us to see Black folks in a particular way to keep us from seeing one another as peers. By seeing these mechanisms, you can identify when bad actors are trying to influence your perceptions of people of color. Now, over and over, I've been hearing white people say things like, "This isn't the America I know. This isn't the America I know." But Black people know this America well. So do Native Americans, Mexicans, and everyone else who isn't white. Now, if you're white like me, you need to know this America. You need to see her for what she is, because there's an important detail about white people that is purposely suppressed. and that is we're not a monolith. That itself is propaganda, because when you look at white Christian nationalism, they operate with the same methodology as neo-Nazis. That is, if you're not a white Christian nationalist, then you're automatically a traitor to your people. They wrapped it in a red, white, and blue flag and call it patriotism, though. They see you as a bigger threat because your whiteness gives you more persuasive power with other white people than people of color have. And that makes sense because, shit, man, we white people, or white men in particular, we barely listen to each other, let alone women or people of color or anyone else that isn't a straight white man. Alternatively, we have the white privilege of ignoring social problems or politics if we really want to. A white man can stick his head in the sand and generally remain unaffected to most of what's going on. You can see that line of thinking in how MAGA vilifies white Democrats and leftists. They say we're unpatriotic. They say we're un-American. They paint us as traitors to enable violence against us. Whiteness does not protect you from white supremacy or white Christian nationalism unless you're also a white supremacist or a white Christian nationalist. In fact, it does the opposite. It puts a target on you. Just look at how they view Alex Preddy and Renee Nicole Good, if you need clear examples. No one's surprised that they mock the death of Keith Porter Jr., a black man who was executed by an off-duty ICE agent, which you may not even know because they barely mentioned the man. But that could be an entire podcast of its own, so let me get back on track. Per his website, Mr. Freddie E. Taylor is a black entrepreneur and a man passionate about black history, culture, and black excellence. His company, Urban Intellectuals, provides a number of products and services for anyone interested in educating others, themselves, or their children on Black history and culture. Now, I originally bought this book because of my personal interest in propaganda, influence, and the way words are used. I figured I would read it, toss it on my shelf, and that would be that. Instead, I found a book that I think could have helped me better understand how my perceptions and opinions of Black folks have been shaped by the propaganda that is embedded in our culture. Now, I tend to view life in my brain like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Every time I'm reading or listening to someone, I'm collecting puzzle pieces to determine if they fit in my puzzle or not. Now, this book helped me to contextualize a handful of pieces to my puzzle because it brought many things I already knew together into an epiphany. And that epiphany is this. Much of how I feel about my whiteness, my masculinity, and place in society was not a conscious, intentional choice. It was shaped by people with deep pockets who value power and money more than anything else. Now, let me be clear. I do not feel guilty about, nor would I ever apologize for being white. In my opinion, that's mostly meaningless performative bullshit. Nobody cares, all right? The idea that Black Americans want us to apologize for being white is more propaganda designed to create divisiveness, anger, and defensiveness. It causes me to think, who are you to judge my life? And that allows the propagandists to then come in and say, see, they hate you for being white. You don't have to apologize for being white anymore. But this book is aimed at educating young Black people about the relevant lies and propaganda that may affect their self-worth and perception of their race. Now, as a white man, I found this book to be incredibly insightful for identifying the different ways that propagandists have shaped my perceptions of not only Black America, but of myself and what it means to be white. I've never sat down and made an intentional interpretation of my whiteness. Much of how I felt about being a white man has been crafted and influenced by propaganda from the day I was born. And even if I did want to get more culturally in touch with my whiteness, I come from a German and English background, y'all. My fucking heritage is probably terrible. So, like, what do you even do in that situation? I'm supposed to be proud of being an American? Gives me a fucking headache. Sorry, that was off script. Anyway, after all, what we see going on in society right now is the culmination of decades of efforts by white Christian nationalists to take over the country. Pitting white people who aren't rich or powerful against people of color has long been a staple in that playbook, all the way back to when they had white settlers killing Native Americans across the United States to take land. And that brings with it a load of mental health issues. Now, I can remember when I was swimming around in the sewers of the internet, and it was just nothing but social maladjustment, mental illness, and trauma as far as the eye can see. I perpetuated my own anger and depression far too often because of what I believed about life and myself. Now, I've mentioned in other episodes how I credit the struggle for Black liberation and Tupac Shakur's work for still being alive. I didn't have a life anything like his, but his work still resonated with me in the deepest pits of my suicidality because I had similar emotions. It's not because of the color of my skin, but instead, it was because I had a severe mental illness that's been trying to kill me since I was about 13 years old. Now, I am quite familiar with anger, hopelessness, emptiness, sadness, and feeling like no one cares and nothing is ever going to change from my past 33 years of living with bipolar disorder. I am well familiar with feeling socially isolated, out of place, and outside of the norm from the 46 years of living with autism on top of that. Now, being on the autistic spectrum, one of the glitches that I've had to navigate is being a low empathy person. Tupac, on the other hand, had a great deal of empathy not only for Black Americans, but for anyone struggling with poverty and survival. The empathy he expressed in his work anchored my low empathy and kept me from getting swept away down the pipeline. I look at people like Jacob Chansley, and I see myself if I had made a few different choices. You may know Chansley better as the QAnon shaman. After he was arrested and imprisoned for his role in January 6th, he was diagnosed with a list of mental illnesses. That includes schizotypal personality disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety, depending on which news articles you look at. Does that excuse what he did? No, it doesn't. But at the same time, as someone that's experienced psychosis myself, you don't get to make informed choices when your mental illness is creating a fictional reality. Even worse, when there is an apparatus that is exploiting your mental illness for their own gain, which is what the right wing does. And the fact is, a lot of mentally ill people wind up behind bars because there aren't many other places for us, thanks to Ronald Reagan and the Republicans cutting services and funding. None of that stuff was ever really replaced. Once psychiatric hospitals closed, we mentally ill people started landing in jail or homeless instead. Yes, forced institutionalization needed to be addressed, and that was good, but it led to less available services altogether. Now I look at the Black struggle and see so many parallels with the struggles of the mentally ill. No money for our communities, vilified and othered, and even discriminated against by our medical professionals. I don't know how bad it still is, but for a while, sympathetic psychiatrists wouldn't actually put your diagnosis of bipolar disorder in your medical records so that other medical professionals wouldn't discriminate against you. Hell, even police brutality. According to the Treatment Advocacy Center, about 25% of police shootings involve people having severe mental health issues. I can relate to wondering whether calling the cops is going to make a situation worse or not. I've been disconnected from reality and psychosis on multiple occasions. What if I'm out of my mind and someone calls 911 for help? It could just as easily be my face on a memorial t-shirt. I'm a 6'4" man who has been interpreted as intimidating several times in the past. I can easily see a cop shooting first and asking questions later. Now, I bought into and love the image of America that was sold to me all my life as a white man in a conservative area. But there's always something I couldn't quite place. There was a point of friction I couldn't identify that came from listening to artists like Tupac. And that point of friction was the sadness that underpinned Shakur's anger in his poetry and rap, and mainstream media and politicians calling rap the glorification of violence. Glorification. My autism senses have tingled about that phrase for a long time. So let's consult with our good friend Merriam-Webster. The most relevant literal definition of glorification is to make glorious by bestowing honor, praise, or admiration. Yeah, I suppose some could be interpreted that way. You have diss tracks and that sort of thing. Men have to posture to appear hard. That's just part of the deal. But on the other hand, you also had songs like Brenda's Got a Baby, a story about a girl who gets pregnant by her molester and everything terrible that follows that. You have songs like Dear Mama, which Tupac wrote to honor his mother's struggles with crack cocaine addiction and trying to raise him right. And you have messages popping up from his work nowadays, such as They Got Money for Wars but Can't Feed the Poor from Keep Your Head Up. See, glorification didn't make sense to me. And it stood out so much because they used it all the time. Much of the music sounded like, I don't want to do this. I want a better life that won't end in tragedy, but what choice do I have? And much of it sounded like resignation more than it did glorification. But if you dig deeper, there's even more context that you may not be aware of, because those messages of glorification of violence and poverty about Black music is not new. White people and conservatives did exactly the same thing with blues and jazz 100 years ago, and rock and roll decades later. And it's not like anyone told me that. I only learned about that incidentally because I was into rock and roll, and I was familiar with conservatives demonizing rock as satanic. And that's where Mr. Taylor's book, 50 Truths They Tried to Erase, enters the picture. It's an automatic recommend to young Black people, or anyone that wants to become better educated about the ways in which history has been whitewashed to erase Black contribution, or what Black folks refer to as Black excellence. I also think that this book would be an excellent entry point for a white person who wants to better understand how our perceptions of Black America are shaped and cultivated and weaponized. Now, it's not what I would call a deep dive. Instead, it highlights different ways our opinions and beliefs are shaped through propaganda and cultural beliefs. I would highly suggest this book to any white person who said, "This isn't the America I know," or "I wish things could go back to the way they were." It'll help you understand why that isn't possible. Because what you're seeing now is what America's always been. It just hasn't been that way to you yet. And now it is. And Mr. Taylor's book can help you start to make sense of it. So let's talk about the structure of the book. The book is divided into 5 sections that are 10 chapters each. Each chapter is about 4 pages long, and the goal of each chapter is to help illustrate the broader point of a section, how to understand the problem and actual steps to be done about it. So let me give you an example. Section 2 is how Black on Black crime is a myth. Now, the first chapter of that section is titled, Crime Happens in Proximity, Not Race. First, Mr. Taylor informs us of important context that's left out of the discussion about Black on Black crime. You've probably heard that phrase a billion times if you've watched mainstream news. Mr. Taylor then moves into some light detail about what we weren't taught, and he mentions redlining. Now, as a white guy, I've heard of redlining, but I never really knew what it was. I knew it was bad and had something to do with neighborhoods, but that was about it. This book prompted me to go read more about it. And let me share with you what I learned. During the 1930s, the government decided to issue government-insured mortgages to help poor people recover after the Great Depression. Part of that process was the creation of color-coded maps. High-risk or low-value areas were outlined and colored in red, making them ineligible for these recovery loans. Guess whose neighborhoods were devalued most often? Did you answer Black neighborhoods? Then you would be correct. Racists would color Black neighborhoods in red to keep Black folks from getting loans to hinder their financial recovery post-Great Depression. This is also where modern homeowners associations have their roots, to protect the quality of their neighborhood and preserve property values, which is just racist doublespeak for keeping the Negroes out. The second point is how the media frames that message. It's most often presented in such a way that one might infer that violence is some innate quality of Black folks. Now, I remember a clear example of this from Hurricane Katrina that kind of burned itself into my brain years ago, where there was a minor scandal when someone pointed out how differently the media was portraying Black and white looters in the aftermath. The media was painting white looters as sympathetic scavengers just trying to survive. On the other hand, they painted Black looters as just being out stealing. I distinctly remember a news clip they showed of a Black man carrying a television in waist-deep water as they talked about the looting. I remember thinking, how do they know he's looting it? Now, I think any reasonable person would assume that he probably stole it. However, we don't know that, and the news isn't supposed to be reporting conjecture. Maybe he was asked to move it by one of his neighbors. Maybe it was his mama's television that she wanted him to walk his ass through waist-deep water to go retrieve so it didn't get ruined. The point is, there were other possibilities, but he was not given the benefit of the doubt like the white looters were. Instead, they used that image in their commentary to allow you to draw a connection in your own brain that, oh, Black people steal, this guy's carrying a television, therefore he stole that television. They also invoked the LA riots, allowing the viewer to subconsciously draw a connection to him and the chaos of the riots. And that was another thing my autistic ass didn't understand at the time. I couldn't figure out what the hell do the LA riots had to do with trying to survive the aftermath of a hurricane. That seemed like comparing apples to hurricanes. And I didn't understand it because it's not meant to be understandable. It was propaganda. It was social and cultural conditioning to perpetuate the stereotype that Black folks are prone to crime when left to their own devices. Now, the third point Mr. Taylor raises is black on black crime is an easy whataboutism to derail meaningful conversations about police brutality, institutional racism, and poverty. And a lot of white folks can't see or acknowledge racism that's baked into the system. Let me give you a crystal clear example, pun intended. That is, the sentencing differences between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. They're essentially the same thing, just in different form. What's different is the user base. Most crack cocaine users were black, and powder cocaine users are white. The sentences for crack cocaine were much harsher than they were for powder cocaine. That disparity is referred to as the 100-to-1 rule from the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. Both 500 grams of cocaine powder and 5 grams of crack cocaine would both invoke a mandatory 5-year sentence. That is about 1 pound of grapes versus a handful of raisins. 5 raisins of crack would get you 5 years minimum. To put it in another context, think of water. Imagine if having a glass of water would get you a year of probation, but a glass of ice would get you 5 years in prison. It's an example of institutional and systemic racism. That is, those laws were set up to disproportionately harm black folks without specifically spelling it out. But even the government acknowledged the unfairness of it when they amended the sentencing guidelines in the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 to raise the limits that would trigger the minimum sentencing. That is also why the destruction of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is such an issue. Conservatives say that the additional restrictions they imposed meant to update it for the modern age, but that's meaningless language because the core issue of anti-black racism is still ongoing and blatant. They just hide it under a layer of plausible deniability. White supremacists shift tactics to respectability a long time ago, like back in the 80s and 90s. They encourage their members to clean up, go into law enforcement and politics. They encourage their members to clean up their language and how they went about projecting their hate. And with the recent ruling by the Supreme Court, as I understand it, the court is saying you need more specific evidence to claim racism with the way maps are drawn. You have to be able to say this was done because of racism. But the white supremacists have been sanitizing their image and methodology since the 80s or 90s, so they don't need to specifically say we're going to disenfranchise the Negroes and Mexicans by drawing the map this way. They already know how to communicate that through subtlety and nuance, through dog whistling to one another. It reminds me of a poignant line from 19th century French author Anatole France that goes, quote, "The law, in its majestic equality, forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread." End quote. And as you can see, not much has changed. Now, after Mr. Taylor wraps up his point, he moves into part 2 of the chapter and explains what the truth is. The truth is that most violent crime happens within the same race due to proximity. Mr. Taylor cites the FBI's 2019 Uniform Crime Report, which shows that when the identity of both the victim and offender are known, 88.9% of black homicide victims were killed by black offenders, while 82.4% of white victims were killed by white offenders. So why is it a black-on-black crime epidemic when the numbers are so close? Why do they go on and on and on and on about black-on-black crime in white spaces when we kill each other just as much? Mr. Taylor then points out that black-on-black crime has long been used as a reason for tough-on-crime policies. That means things like mandatory minimum sentencing, 3 strikes law, stop and frisk, more police, more prisons, and the militarization of law enforcement. The land of the free and home of the brave is number 1 in incarceration. We have about 2 million prisoners, with China just behind us at about 1.6 million. The population of China is 1.4 billion people, whereas the United States is 340 million. And Mr. Taylor points out that the stigma and shame of the narrative, we kill each other, is also a tool of oppression aimed at fracturing black communities. It breeds distrust within their communities, which prevents organization and collective action. Collective action would get things like housing justice, education equity, or access to health care, all of which would help reduce black-on-black crime rates if the establishment were actually interested in fixing the problem. Because if they were interested in fixing it, we'd be talking about different solutions to improve those environments. Now I have to be critical for a moment. I don't like this claim that Mr. Taylor makes about algorithms specifically pushing black-on-black violence to help fan the flames. As someone who works in digital marketing, it wouldn't surprise me if that were the case. Tech companies doing shady shit is just par for the course. My problem is the certainty in which it is expressed. Search engines treat their algorithm as proprietary data that's usually layered in NDAs and secrecy. In my mind, that makes it impossible to accurately make a definitive statement about how they work. You can make educated guesses, but that's about as far as you can go without drifting into speculation. And I feel like it undermines the validity of the criticism, because it makes me wonder if Mr. Taylor experienced confirmation bias because algorithms are going to show you content that is relevant to you and your interests. So hypothetically, if Mr. Taylor's drawn the conclusion by looking at social justice oriented content, one could think the algorithm is just giving him more of what he was telling the algorithm he wanted. Now, algorithms are constantly trying to figure out what you want so they can give you more of it, which keeps you on their app longer, which pushes up their monthly active user rates, which increases ad revenue. So I would be curious where that particular statement originates from, or if it's an opinion rather than a fact. Right now, it reads as an assertion of fact rather than an opinion. And that kind of distinction matters when you're talking about such sticky subjects. That criticism aside, his final example still carries weight, and that is the framing of white mass shooters as a mental health problem while simultaneously giving no sympathy or benefit of the doubt to black shooters. Instead, it's pushed as a cultural and social problem in black communities. Now, finally, we close out the chapter on part 4, action and reflection. Mr. Taylor provides a couple questions for the reader to reflect on. And let's do a reflection together right now. When was the last time you heard anyone use the term white on white crime? Because I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. And don't say right now, because that doesn't count. Was your answer never? Like mine? In the 46 years I've been alive, I have never heard anyone use the phrase white on white crime. Not once. In fact, while I was thinking about that, I actually decided to go and Google the phrase to see what actually comes up. And most of the results appear to be something to the effect of, why don't we talk about white on white crime? Which is very telling. From there, Mr. Taylor provides a few actionable items for the reader to take away into their personal life. For example, he suggests sharing the full context of racial crime statistics, the 88.9% versus 82.4%, with 5 people who still believe this myth. And congratulations, you are now one of my 5. You will always know that phrase as propaganda every time you hear it from now on. Then there's a section about community action, such as supporting violence interruption programs by black leaders in local communities. I specifically highlight that point for a reason, because as a bona fide saltine American, I can see why some white folks would balk at the idea, but I agree with it because this is the struggle they've been living for centuries and they know it better than anyone else. You know, to all my fellow white people who want to make a difference or try to step into a leadership position, I would encourage you to study more about effective leadership. Because one of the most important qualities of a good leader is knowing how to be a good follower. Because in mixed company, you're better off listening to people of color who are the leaders. In situations outside of that, sometimes being a good leader means stepping to the side and letting a follower take the lead on something they already know well. You know, you pave the way for them to succeed, to use the skills and talents that they have that you don't have. That way, the group succeeds. But I digress. Mr. Taylor closes every chapter with a final thought. And the final thought for this chapter is, crime is about proximity, poverty, and policy, not race. By understanding that truth, we can dismantle the greatest lie ever told against Black Americans and clear the path to true justice. End quote. Justice is something that's always been woefully lacking in this country. The only other piece of critical feedback I have is some of the sourcing. I spent a few years working for attorneys and doctors writing content that was legal and medical information that does not constitute legal or medical advice. To say that they were ruthless in their evaluation of my work would be an understatement. The standard that was laid out for me is that any sources or claims needed to be able to stand up to the scrutiny of an ethics board. Now, Mr. Taylor cites Wikipedia a couple times and the Heritage Foundation. Not a fan of either of those as primary sources. Wikipedia is never a good primary source for serious work. Any source that can be edited by just anyone is out immediately. It's a great place to start, though. You find plenty of great materials from the sources the articles are derived from, or facts to verify from a better source. That actually reminds me of one of the things we used to do in troll communities was we would try to sneak edits onto Wikipedia for fun. You'd have one group of people start shit posting everywhere, and other would try to slip small fake edits in while the editors were distracted. And eventually it would get caught and weeded out, but sometimes the edit would remain for weeks. And that is why we don't rely on Wikipedia as a primary source. Now, the Heritage Foundation is a far-right think tank. Any information taken from them needs to be dissected to understand what purpose it's actually serving. Think tanks like the Heritage Foundation have helped bring us to where we are today. Now, as I close out this episode, I'm going to give you some action and reflection of your own. As a white person, buy yourself a copy of this book and leave it on your nightstand. When you get up in the morning, before you go to bed, read one chapter. It's only 4 pages. Take time throughout your day to reflect on what you read. Think about how you feel. Do you feel angry, defensive? That's the programming, conditioning, and propaganda pushing back, trying to keep you from seeing the truth. You may need to push back on your own emotions to remain objective. I know that once I start getting angry and defensive, I don't think as clearly. I start defaulting into my own habits and perceptions. That does not mean you need to believe everything you read. We're trying to avoid the knee-jerk reaction of, that's bullshit, before we give it enough serious examination. Instead, ask yourself, have I been able to see this in my own life or experiences? Because I know a lot of my fellow white people don't recognize America right now, or they want things to go back how they were. But you can't. This is what America's been since its inception. Donald Trump is not some anomaly. He's just a reflection of what America truly is because we refuse to fully address and rectify the sins of the past. Thank you for spending your time with me. You can find Freddie E. Taylor's 50 Truths They Tried to Erase, Black Power, Culture, and Resistance Uncovered, as well as a variety of other educational products and services on his website at storeurbanintellectuals.com. There's a link in the show notes. Thank you, Urban Intellectuals, and Mr. Taylor for granting permission for me to review your book.